Good evening, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Yoav Elinevsky. I'm a member of MAPA and the Latin America Solidarity Coalition of Western Mass, the organizers of this webinar. We have with us very special guest this evening. Adriana Guzman Arroyo is the leader of the anti-patriarchal communitarian feminism in Bolivia. She will speak to us from La Paz. Leonardo Flores is a Latin America policy expert and campaigner with Code Pink. And Kevin Young, professor of history at UMass Amherst, who will be the moderator. Thank you very much, Adriana, Leo, and Kevin, for taking the time to enlighten us. The victory of the movement towards socialism, MAS, in the recent general election in Bolivia last November was a special event in the history of the struggle of the people of Latin America to build people democracy, justice, solidarity, and socialism. This victory came a year after a military coup, the Lithium coup, supported by the US, which deposed the democratically elected government of Evo Morales, the leader and creator of the MAS movement, and imposed a brutal right-wing, criminal, neoliberal, and genocidal government on the people of Bolivia. The people and the MAS victory in Bolivia sends a message of hope across the globe that the popular sectors in Latin America can be trusted. They are wise to reject the Washington consensus and the neoliberal world order imposed by the US. They understand that a return to an unrestrained market economy and dependence on foreign dictates mean widespread misery for the majority of the people, while the current path has the potential for a brighter future. In other countries in Latin America, there is an upsurge in the popular demands for radical changes. We are fortunate that Leo is with us because he is a Venezuelan American with deep knowledge and experiences in the region, and he will be able to widen the conversation and give us a regional context to the current events in Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador as well. So without further ado, I will give the floor now to Kevin Young, who will be the moderator for this event. Go ahead, Kevin.
All right, thank you, Yoav, and it's great to see everyone out there through the screen. I teach Latin American history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and my special focus is Bolivian history in the 20th century. So I'm not going to start with a long introduction or anything. I think I'm just going to turn it over to the speakers because that's who everyone wants to hear. So I will go to them in just a minute. But first, I just want to highlight how severely the COVID pandemic has impacted Bolivia. I think that living in the United States, it's easy not to be aware of just how hard it has hit the Bolivian population. At one point this last year, in October, Bolivia ranked third in the world for per capita deaths due to COVID-19, third in the world on a per capita basis. So it gives you a sense of just how catastrophic the pandemic has been there, in spite of the fact that it's a very small population relative to other countries. It's about 11 or 12 million people. I think that the number is not quite as, Bolivia is no longer in the third position, but the pandemic remains very severe, and the economic damage as well has been tremendous. So I'm sure that our speakers, Adriana and Leonardo, will have a lot of insightful analysis to offer to us. And I want to alert you to the chat box where you can post questions and comments while they're speaking, and I will do my best as moderator to note those down as I see them, and then make sure that they are raised after the speakers are done speaking. Now, I think we only have an hour, so it's possible that we may not get to every question or comment, but we'll do our best. So we're going to start with Adriana Guzman Arroyo, who is a leader, as Yoav said, of the anti-patriarchal communitarian feminism collective in La Paz, and she is speaking to us from La Paz tonight. So Adriana.
Aski Aruma Kipanaya, buenas noches, compañeras, compañeros. Soy Adriana Guzmán y bueno, para poder compartir un poco lo que está sucediendo aquí.
Disculpa, Adriana. Disculpa, Adriana. Si disculpa la interrupción.
Sirve a los partidos políticos de derecha, sirve a los... Sí. Sí.
Gracias. Sorry, technical difficulties. We're set.
Buenas noches, gracias por la convocatoria.
Good evening, and thank you for the invitation.
Para poder compartir lo que está sucediendo en
so that I can share what is happening in Bolivia and in La Paz regarding what's happening with the pandemic. And for us, the pandemic is related to patriarchy and capitalism and colonialism, with interests from right-wing political parties and right-wing governments that have been affecting the pandemic, and right-wing governments that have been trying to clamp down on revolutions and people's movements in our territory in Abya Yala. And that's what the pandemic. Sí.
Bueno, yo quiero hablar primero de
I would first like to speak about the context in which the pandemic occurred, in which the pandemic began, which Yoav mentioned, which has to do with the coup against the people, the coup against the state that began in 2019. And then when we began 2020 with a de facto government, the pandemic for us came with that coup, so they're together. The de facto government harmed the public health service as a way of oppressing indigenous communities and pressing poor people who identify with the movement towards socialism, especially the indigenous peoples, migrants, and popular sectors. So the pandemic was used as a form of repression in different territories. Denying access to health has been a form of repression. The specific things that the de facto regime left us has been the unraveling of the public health system. They modified the public health system. They modified the agencies within the ministry. They closed, for example, the Ministry of Traditional Medicine. They changed leadership in the health ministry. They cut the budget as well. They cut the budget for the pandemic. There was no strategy. There was no emergency budget. So in 2020, when this de facto government was in power, they practically the people had to take on the health problems or the health challenges to face the virus. And that's where we came up with the slogan was that only the people can save the people and only the people can heal the people. So one of the primary things that came about in 2020 was the use of traditional medicine and the exchange of traditional medicine from different communities within the country. So the de facto government had closed health centers in many places. They had denied medicine to many people. So with all this crisis in the health system, so that's why in October 2020, the people won the elections. They beat fascism, they beat racism, and Luis Arce became the president, and he inherited a very deep public health crisis. So what has been the main measures the government has taken? And these are the ones that have been effective. First, the fact that they enabled access at a national level to the quick tests, so that this allows people who have the virus to be detected soon and before they reach a critical stage of the disease. Because the virus has been, has had less of an impact in rural areas. So now we have the security to be able to face the virus, which we didn't have before, because we didn't have the tests, we didn't have respirators. There was lots of corruption and embezzlement. There was supposed purchases of respirators, of ventilators, but they never arrived in hospitals. 70% of hospitals did not have ventilators when the MAS came into power last year. So the MAS has brought the quick tests. They have given ventilators to the hospitals, especially the most populous areas, and that has enabled us to face the pandemic and has reactivated the public health system and public health centers in different communities, which had been defunded by the de facto government. So as you may know, there have been important purchases of vaccines. We've got our second shipment of vaccines recently. And so the people first getting vaccinated have been health professionals. And now people with chronic diseases are being vaccinated. Obviously, a significant part of the population in Bolivia is indigenous. We're Aymaras, we're Quechuas. And there's a discussion about the vaccine within our communities. But access to the vaccine, there's an access to the vaccine has involved a strategy, a plan that the government implemented. Another thing I think is very important has been the reactivation of groups, of medical brigades, of professionals, health professionals who studied in Cuba and who have a vision of community health. So this is broken with the monopoly of health that doctors who were against the MAS had, the movement towards socialism. Nevertheless, despite these things, which I think are important, we still don't have a clear strategy at a national level of how the pandemic is being faced. So far, we've had 250,000 people who've had COVID-19, 250,000, 250,000, a little bit more. There are close to 12,000 people who have died. And most of the contagious cases are in the populous areas, especially in the east, where there are no restrictions, where there's no control, especially in manufacturing places, in soya exporting factories, where the oligarchies are, there's no control. And that's where we're seeing the most amount of cases. It's not clear what the strategy is to face this second wave that we're living through, this second wave of contagions, where the deaths have come much faster than in the first wave. We haven't been able to find medicine that has worked. The protocols have changed, the health protocols, so that has been a problem. to face the second wave. And we believe that we're expecting a third wave for June. And we're preparing for that. But it's not clear what the strategy was going to be yet. Because the strategy, in my opinion, has to involve, businesses and factories that have no controls or biosecurity measures, where exploitation because of capitalism is ongoing and there's been no quarantine for the workers. Another thing I think is important to raise is what the main problem is for it has been the medical sector. The coup against the state, the coup against the people in 2019 was begun by the health sector. It was begun by doctors who have a tradition in the world that is based on colonialism, racism, hierarchy, but who have always been against the government of the movement towards socialism. This has been a sector of political destabilization that's been ongoing, and they were part of the coup. During the coup, they were on the streets. They hurt many people. They were allies of Áñez and Camacho. They were part of the coup. Now, during the pandemic, on February 19th, in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of the second wave, the medical sector declared a general strike, an indefinite general strike in Bolivia. So from February 19th, there's been a medical strike. That is the main problem we face in facing the pandemic. The reason for this strike is political. It's an attempt to destabilize the government. It's aimed to create social convulsion and social strife. The argument for the strike is opposition to an emergency health law that was promoted or signed by President Arce in February. The points that they are in disagreement with are price controls in private clinics. There's a regulation of prices to prevent, price gouging in clinical clinics, in private clinics, because they charge too much. So this law establishes a regulation of prices. The second thing this law establishes is that you cannot engage in a health strike or have protests from the health sector during the pandemic. So because of these two things, the School of Medicine, the union of doctors, has declared a general strike as of February 19th. Yesterday, they reaffirmed that the strike will continue until March 15th at least, unless the law is struck down. The president of the National Medical School is also a candidate in the elections for the Department of La Paz in the city of La Paz. He's a candidate for the mayor's race. So parallel to this, he's calling for a medical strike to block the arrival of the vaccines and the quick tests. So they're engaging in a campaign to take over the subnational governments for the right and to undertake a strategy to destabilize the country. One of the main actors, one of the main allies that the right has today to continue the coup, to continue destabilizing the government, is the medical sector. Now, not every health center has taken part in this strike. Many are operating in an emergency manner. But the others, they deny care, they deny medicine. They put their patients at risk. 2 days ago, 2 patients escaped from hospital, and they talked about how they were closed in with other patients, locked in. So 2 days ago, 2 patients from hospital one of the bigger hospitals, escaped and told everyone.
Han escapado del hospital y han contado cómo
They escaped the hospital and they told everyone how the patients have been completely abandoned, how doctors are locking patients in, they're not giving them food, they're not cleaning the rooms, they're not being given medicine. So they escaped and have denounced this. So there are doctors who are not on strike, but are still denying care. So they're basically politicizing this situation, and it's going on at a national level. Practically, we can say that there's a push from the government that's trying to deal with COVID, but the medical sector is interfering with that. So as we did in 2020, we're undergoing a strategy of self-organization, community brigades, community health brigades, brigades to indigenous peoples, of indigenous peoples who use traditional medicines along with some other medicines to give care, particularly early on. So the idea is that the people have to save the people, and we have to organize in the face of these measures, these pressure from the fascists, from the genociders. So that was my remarks to start with.
All right, thank you very much, Adriana. And I think you raised some really important issues there about the structural power of conservative and right-wing sectors in places like Bolivia. Thinking about the capitalists in Eastern Bolivia that remain so powerful, even after a decade and a half of progressive government. Those sectors remain so entrenched and they retain so much economic power in the country that it's something that we really have to think about. And the point that you raised about the way that they are impeding the fight against the pandemic, I think is very important. And likewise with the healthcare professionals as well. So I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions and post comments in the chat as we're moving along, and I will do my best to raise those after Leonardo is done speaking. So now we're going to move to Leonardo Flores. Leonardo is a Latin American policy expert and a campaigner with Code Pink, and was also an electoral observer in the October 2020 presidential elections in Bolivia, which resulted in the victory of Luis Arce. So Leonardo.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks so much to Massachusetts Peace Action for this invite and the Latin America Solidarity Committee. I'm really impressed with all the work you do, so it's really quite a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today. I think Adriana really summed it up super well in terms of what's going on with COVID in Bolivia. And I think there's a lot of parallels really with what's going on with COVID here in the US in terms of, you had a Trump administration that really failed to deal with the pandemic. And now you have the incoming Biden administration that's kind of scrambling to catch up. And that's what we've seen from the Arce administration in Bolivia, this kind of scramble to catch up. And as Adriana mentioned, there's been this really ridiculous health strike. And I would just add, although to underline a bit, one of the points she made is that this emergency health law also kind of was seen as a way for Cuban doctors to come back into the country. As many of you may know, right after the coup happened in November 2019, the coup government banned Cuban doctors. They forced them to go back to Cuba, despite the fact that these were doctors who were serving underserved communities, particularly the rural, poor, indigenous peoples. And the coup regime expelled them. So of course, immediately you had a huge problem when the pandemic hit, because these populations that are already traditionally underserved really lost a lifeline, because the Cuban doctors, as Adriana mentioned, practice kind of community medicine, community-based healthcare. And so that's kind of also a big factor in the medical strike that's going on. And we've seen how badly the pandemic has been politicized in Bolivia. I would also add that, just, in late February, Bolivia got its first doses of the vaccine. Many of these came from China. I think there were something like 500,000 doses came from China. They arrived in eastern Bolivia, and 100,000 of those was a free donation from the Chinese government. So it really speaks to the cooperation, the international cooperation that the Arce government has been able to engage in since coming into power in October 2020. And also, one of the big scandals of the pandemic and the coup regime was that they had purchased respirators, sorry, not purchased, but they had received a donation of respirators, face masks, medicine, and other supplies. It was donated by China early on in the days of the pandemic, and it was abandoned in the sense that it was abandoned in China. They never went through with the plans to bring it over to the country. And this just finally arrived just last week, almost a year after this donation was made. These items were finally able to be sent to Bolivia because the coup government had kind of refused to accept it. And they did it in such a way that, they didn't tell anyone what was going on. And it wasn't until much later that people found out that all this equipment had been made available to the Bolivian people, but the coup regime was holding on to it and refusing to bring it. One of the things people in Bolivia have been denouncing recently is that, again, in the east, which is where Bolivia's economic powerhouse is in the east, and also it happens to be where you have a higher concentration of white European Bolivians of white and European ancestry, and it's where coup attempt after coup attempt has started in Bolivia, has been in the eastern part of the country. And now there's word that in private clinics in Santa Cruz, which is one of the major cities of the east, they're vaccinating their staff, which actually goes against the protocols, because public hospitals are the priority, given that most of the country goes to public hospitals rather than private clinics. And that's due to the fact that local governors are in charge of vaccine distribution. And so even the vaccine itself is being politicized. So, Bolivia is facing many, many challenges regarding the pandemic. I think there is hope in sight, in the sense that, as Adriana said, this idea of the people heal the people save the people. And I think that's going to be kind of a game changer, because it will allow, contact tracing at a very community level to go on. It'll allow people who need the medicine to directly receive it. And it's going to function as sort of an accountability process where, organized communities are going to be able to tell the government directly where the flaws in the system are. So I think that's, something that is really going to be able to help Bolivia handle the pandemic. And of course, when we talk about the pandemic in Latin America and most countries, and really in this country as well, for many people, there's two faces to it. There's, of course, the health implications of the disease and how deadly it is and how much destruction it's caused. But there's also the economic aspect and how it's destroyed our economies. In Bolivia, the coup regime implemented or attempted to implement kind of a strict quarantine, stay-at-home measures. But as we heard from Adriana, these weren't really followed, particularly in the East, where a lot of the manufacturing goes on. But they were followed in other countries, not in other cities and in other parts of the country. And they were kind of imposed on the people in such a way that there was no action taken to prevent the poor, to prevent the working class from facing the worst economic effects of the pandemic. And this is a country where I think something like 80% of the labor force is in the informal market. So you can't just tell them to work from home. It's either they go out on the streets and work every day, or they don't have anything to eat. There was no plan in place to say distribute food. There was no plan to send checks monthly. I think they got one check during the whole pandemic, much like we did here in the United States. But it's really hit the poor very hard, which is kind of almost by design, because the coup regime was very neoliberal in nature. And it really have to stress that before the coup regime, during the tenure of Evo Morales, Bolivia had cut poverty by 46% and extreme poverty by almost 60%. So they were really on a path towards equitable development in terms of bringing people out of poverty, in terms of making the country more equal and improving health and education and other social services. And then the coup regime really imposed a kind of a neoliberal austerity package that has really done quite a bit to wreck the Bolivian economy. And so that's a challenge that the Arce administration is facing right now. And so, for example, the coup regime entered into this illegal loan with the IMF for $330 million roughly, uh, despite the fact that Bolivia had before, during the Morales government, had cut ties with the IMF in terms of not owing the IMF any money, because, as we know from the history of the IMF in Latin America, these loans come with many conditions that impose more austerity, that privatize, that deregulate certain markets and policies. And then the Arce government was really forced to pay this money back, and they had to pay the interest on top of that, which is about $24 million. And to me, not that I think it was really the right move to do it, but it's crazy that Bolivia, took out this loan for $330 million. They repaid it within months, and now they have to pay interest on top of that because of a loan that was illegal in the first place. So, many challenges facing the Arce government, but I think and it's going to be tough to see how they proceed forward. There's elections, as Adriana mentioned. There are elections this Sunday in Bolivia, subnational elections, which are for governors, mayors, and city councils. And even that, as she mentioned, like the pandemic is playing its effects there. The coup regime is, excuse me, not the coup regime, but there's still actors that were, very much a part of the coup who are now running in these elections, including Añez, who was the coup president, and including Fernando Camacho, who was one of the coup leaders in the East, who's, and was a presidential candidate in October 2020. He comes from a very white Christian fundamentalist background, and that's the ideology he's trying to impose. And these people were very, complicit and might be legally responsible for many of the massacres that occurred right after the coup began in November 2020, the massacres in Secata and Sacaba, 2019. And now it's going to be interesting to see what happens in terms of whether they face justice for their crimes, because many of them will now have, hold office after Sunday, because a few of them are expected to win. So, be prepared for criticism from the U.S. when the Bolivian government does go after these people. They're going to say, oh, well, it's political persecution. Well, it's not going to be anything of the sort. The thing is, it's going to be justice for the victims of the coup regime, and hopefully the government will find a way to get out of this very tricky situation that it's going to find itself in terms of the response by the so-called, the West, really being the United States and its allies, when it comes to having the coup regime and the coup leaders face justice. I think I'll leave it there, because I think I'm really kind of fascinated with what Adriana has to say. So I'd like to hear a bit more from her.
All right, thank you very much, Leonardo. We do have a few questions that have come in the chat. I'm trying to keep track of them. I think I will maybe just give you all the questions right away and let you both respond to them in turn. So we have a question from Martha, asking about what are the dependable news sources for tracking events in Bolivia, and presumably in both English and in Spanish. So for our audience, this question would be for Leonardo and for Adriana. What news sources do you recommend for tracking daily news, as well as getting deeper analysis of Bolivian political developments? Actually, why don't we just start with that question? I think that's enough to start. So Adriana, would you like to start?
Sí, pero no entendí la pregunta.
Oh, she didn't understand the question. I'm going to retranslate it.
Es que no escucho. Bueno, no sé exactamente cuáles son los medios más confiables,
I'm not
pero
sure which are the most dependable ones. The government has a national system that is called Boliviana de Televisión, and they present information from the government, but it's much more dependable than any other media outlet, which are the property of the right, of the oligarchy, of the fascist groups. So the media, the corporate media, the mainstream media, permanently lie, they constantly lie, especially with anything related to the coup or the pandemic and anything political. So the national stations are the ones that are most trustworthy, in my opinion. And on my part, I would have to say, yeah, I completely agree in terms of the private media is really in the hands of the right in Bolivia, and is not a good source of information for people, especially for progressives in the United States. But my favorite source of information on Bolivia is Causachun Coca News. They do have a Twitter account in English. I'll look for it and post it in the chat in a little bit. But there's a really brilliant young journalist named Ali Vargas who is of British Bolivian descent, and he does very fantastic news in English about Bolivia from a people's perspective. So I strongly suggest that you follow Ali.
Mhm. All right, thank you both. So let's see here. There's one comment from Elizabeth asking about vaccine apartheid going on in many countries. And of course, this is a concern that we all have about equitable access to vaccines. So perhaps Leonardo or Adriana could speak a bit about the Arce government's plans for rolling out the vaccine when the vaccine doses become available.
bueno, la información que ha planteado el
Well,
gobierno
the
por la
information the Arce government has given us regarding the vaccine plan is that vaccines are going to be for the people. Once the health sector has gotten vaccinated, then the vaccine will go to the poorest sectors, will go to people with chronic diseases, especially those who don't have resources. So that's a strategy for preventing COVID among the people. So I would also like to add that this is a very important strategy, but we have to understand that it's the only possible way given what the media is doing, because since we have 11,000 people who have died here, it's not because of COVID, it's because of the irresponsibility, because of the genocidal policies that doctors are undertaking in health centers as part of this right-wing campaign.
Para nosotras, lo dijimos en ese momento,
So we said it at the time, that coups are overthrown in the streets. So even if it can be resolved with elections, the correlation of forces isn't. The correlation of forces is resolved on the streets. And we have to face these fascist groups, these armed groups, these paramilitary groups, parastate groups, police groups. They continue to be active, and they often work hand in hand with these doctors. They carry out repression, mobilizations. So it's a very kind of complex situation in this regard.
Thank you, Adriana. I don't know, Leonardo, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, all the information I've seen, it has been that there isn't going to be any sort of apartheid in regards to the vaccines, at least the public ones. But as I already mentioned, we already have seen some private clinics start vaccinating their staff in defiance of the health protocols and the health plan that was already put in place. So it might happen to some extent for sure.
Thanks. So a couple of questions about short-term political prospects in Bolivia, and I'm going to combine a couple questions here, one from Manny, another from Yoav. So Manny asks about prospects for prosecution of the coup regime officials like Áñez. Is this going to be possible going forward? We know that it is a goal of social movement sectors. And Yoav asks about the prospects for the Sunday local elections in Bolivia. What do we expect will come of that? So Adriana, why don't we start with you?
In the first conversation that we had, we proposed the importance of carrying out justice for the people who carried out this massacre, the people who were responsible for the coup, who were responsible for the massacres. There were 48 siblings who died, who were murdered. 36 in 2019, and 12 who died from bullets from the repression led by Áñez and Camacho. And regarding the elections, given that Luis Fernando Camacho and Áñez are candidates, so going to elections under these conditions, I think it's, in some sense, accepting that it wasn't a coup. So today, the problem in prosecuting them is establishing that if there was a coup, if Áñez had a transition government, if the orders that she carried out were carried out under an emergency. So it's all very confusing because of how the coup happened. And we haven't had the tools to prosecute Áñez and Camacho. Personally, I believe that there wasn't a political decision. The government took the political decision not to prosecute them because that would have led to more mobilization and destabilization. So for me, they should have been prosecuted, at least Camacho and Áñez, because now that they're candidates, it's going to be much more difficult to prosecute them. And that injustice, that impunity, is a great frustration for social movements that sustain the government. So we're facing a very difficult contradiction at this moment, because just like we need vaccines, just like we need the economic crisis to end, we also need justice. We can't continue in a democracy and allow impunity for the Secata massacres of 2019. So personally, I think it was a political error to not prosecute them, at least them. I understand that it's more complex to prosecute members of the military because they could undertake another coup, and there has to be other strategies. But leaving Camacho free has been a huge mistake by the government, and it's gonna have consequences later on. On the other hand, only one member of the military has been prosecuted, and he was prosecuted last week. And so he's under arrest, but he's the only one. So at this time, we're going to elections knowing that the right wing has candidates, and the options are to vote for the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism, but despite the fact that there's no political intention to carry out justice for the coup. So regarding the results, in general terms, I think the coup will continue. It's very likely that Fernando Camacho will win in Santa Cruz. He'll become the government of Santa Cruz. The mayor of Santa Cruz will likely be a right-wing winner as well. So Santa Cruz will remain in the right. Cochabamba is a very important city, and it's a bastion of the movement towards socialism. So there we have a former member of the military who will likely win, who took part in the dictatorships, who was responsible for a massacre in 2003 and took part in the coup. And despite all the attempts to disqualify him, today he was allowed to run. And it's most likely that he's going to win in Cochabamba. In La Paz, it's also probable that Ivan Arias will win. He was the minister of Janine Áñez. He was part of the coup. He was a minister who took a lot, who was very repressive, racist. So the main cities in the country, the biggest ones, they might end up in right-wing hands. And that worries me, especially the city of La Paz, which is where the center of the government is, where they can destabilize, which is where the coup took place, where the material fact that you can take the presidency out there. So it's possible that the movement towards socialism will lose in La Paz. So the political errors, in my opinion, were not prosecuting the right wing. And the second one was the way they elected candidates internally within the MAS. There's this idea of trying to convince the middle class, of convincing the sectors that took part in the coup rather than appealing to indigenous and community sectors. So it's a very colonial idea. And so I think that's a big problem. And there's been a lot of discontent within social movements about how this was carried out. And lots of communities are thinking about punishing the MAS at the polls. So I think organizations have decided to fight the right on the streets, which is where this problem has to be resolved. And then, yeah, I mean, I would add that, I think it's really important to note that the MAS is basically the only national party at this point in Bolivia, in the sense that, for example, Creemos, which is Camacho's party, is really only located in the eastern part of the country, in Santa Cruz. Comunidad Ciudadana, which was the party of, I'm totally blanking on his name, but basically the second place candidate in last year's elections, they're really only active in about 4 or 5 departments. So the right wing, despite the fact that they do have, significant power throughout the country, they're fragmented. And the MAS is still kind of represents the unity on the left, and they have candidates basically running in every election, whereas these other parties do not. They're focusing on, one or on several kind of key places, but they don't have candidates running everywhere. So in that sense, I think the MAS is going to take a wide majority of, the overall total of the mayor's races, governor's races, and city councils. But as Adriana said, there's this big problem of where the right wing has power and how they've been able to maintain power in these bases, particularly in Santa Cruz and La Paz. And regarding the first question, I mean, in terms of prosecuting these people responsible for the massacres, yeah, I think it's been difficult, especially because the MAS, they faced a very tricky situation back in November 2019, in the sense that right before the coup happened, you had social movements, social organizations, they wanted to take to the streets, and you had the government, the MAS at the time, saying, you know what, no, let's keep things calm. They thought they were going to be able to put a lid on the coup, and then things just almost overnight. I mean, it was in less than a month that this coup really happened, and the MAS the government, wasn't able to respond adequately to it, because there was really a disconnect at that point between the leadership of the MAS and these social movements, these social organizations. The way that the MAS was able to come back to power, it wasn't just through the ballot box, as Adriana said. It was through massive mobilizations, massive protests in June, July, August of 2020 that forced the coup regime into a vote, and that forced, a vote to happen in the first place. And that's how the coup leaders were defeated eventually. But it's still a very tricky situation. I mean, just in the days right when Arce was inaugurated, you had Evo Morales warn of another coup that was being planned. And then you had a couple of generals come out and say that they stopped the coup because they identified with the MAS. So that, to me, what that says is that there's a lot of right-wing support within the military for another coup. And I think the MAS has kind of been acting, they've been maybe dragging their feet on terms of prosecuting Áñez, in terms of prosecuting Camacho, because they fear instability, and because they fear what the response will be from, the United States, for example. All right. I mean, despite the fact that we have a new administration in the United States, there's absolutely no indication that foreign policy towards Bolivia is going to change in any significant way. The allies of the Biden administration are the same ones as the Trump administration. So I think that's one of the main reasons they're dragging their feet. But on the other hand, I think there's also a movement to sue some of these actors in civil courts. There's a really interesting lawyer down in Bolivia who's part of the Harvard law school and clinic of, I forget what, but his name's Tommy Becker. And he's doing really great work in terms of organizing a lawsuit against Áñez and against some of these people that took part in the coup. So it might end up being the case that these civil suits are going to have more of an impact on the right than any kind of state prosecution will. But it's something that's yet to be determined.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you. And Leonardo, your comment there about the military and the way that the MAS officialdom may be holding back from prosecution based on a fear of the military reaction is again another indication of the power that some of these traditional reactionary forces in Bolivia still hold, which is easy to forget when we think about how long the MAS has been in power at the national level since 2005, 2006. One more question about the larger Latin American context. We've had a couple of questions in the chat about Venezuela, about Ecuador. Ecuador, of course, recently had elections. We don't know the final outcome yet, but there is a good likelihood that the left of center candidate, Arauz, will take the victory. Perhaps Adriana and Leonardo could comment a bit on the larger context in Latin America and why it may be significant for the Arce administration and Bolivia's current challenges.
I think it's important, this attempt to recompose UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, which had Argentina, Ecuador. It's important, and to have, again, progressive left-wing governments. So that's going to be, the result in Ecuador is going to be important. But there is a problem. It's that the fight against the right isn't done only by the governments. We might have new left-wing governments, but they were going to be weak, and they're going to face a right wing that's been stronger. And we're going to have social movements that have been weakened, not by the right, but by their own relations with their government, with their left-wing governments, and which fail to meet the demands of these organizations of living well, of decolonization, of patriarchy. So Ecuador didn't play a very good role in terms of indigenous peoples. So I think it's important that we have a left-wing government in Ecuador, but the main thing will be to re-strengthen social movements and social organizations to resist the attacks from the right. It's not enough to have the right. Excuse me, it's not enough to have the governments in power. We need the social movements as well. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Adriana is saying in terms of having these governments in power is not enough, especially because what we really saw when, you had this betrayal by Lenin Moreno in Ecuador, you had the coup in Bolivia, you had Nayib Bukele in El Salvador going to the right, you had Brazil going to the right, Argentina, so many countries going to the right. And that really harmed social movements, not just in the countries that we're talking about, but in a regional sense, in the sense that they kind of lost the connection that they had been building with each other, because these connections were basically made from the top down, in a sense, because governments were organizing these huge forums where social movements would come and organize, but they were being done by governments rather than by the social movements themselves. So recently in Bolivia, there was a very interesting meeting, and it was basically a meeting of social movements from Latin America. And one of the proposals that came out of that was to have RUNASUR, RUNASUR, which is kind of a people's UNASUR. UNASUR is the Union of South American Nations. It was this proposal to, it was basically going to function like an EU or a more local organization of American states. And it was to deal with multilateral issues that arose. And UNASUR became really important early on. It was, I think, founded in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. And in 2008, there was a coup attempt against Evo Morales. There was a massacre in Bolivia, and UNASUR played a really important role in kind of tamping down on that coup and making sure that nothing happened in terms of, there was even a separatist movement at the time. So UNASUR came in with a fact-finding mission and played an important role in bringing peace back to Bolivia at that time. And then because of, really it's because of US imperialism, UNASUR began to be divided. There was this plan dating back from the Bush government, but also involving the Obama and Trump governments as well, to divide Latin America and to break down these multilateral organizations that had sprung up. It wasn't just UNASUR, it was also CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. There was ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of the Americas, and Petrocaribe, for example. And so there was this very clear intent on the part of the United States, the State Department, to break these organizations apart, despite the fact that when they were constituted, they included not just the left-wing governments, but also right-wing governments as well. And then as a direct result of the pressure from the United States, right-wing governments began to pull off from UNASUR and from ALBA. And now we're seeing kind of the reverse happening, right? So when Arce came into power, when he was inaugurated, one of the first things he tried to do is to strengthen UNASUR again, strengthen CELAC again, and that's been a key priority for him. It's also a key priority for Andrés Arauz, the left-wing candidate in Ecuador. And let me just kind of switch tacks real quick, because what we're seeing in Ecuador right now is pretty similar in many ways to what we saw in Bolivia. In terms of the coup, and especially the role the OAS is playing in Ecuador. I mean, in Ecuador, you have this left-wing candidate, Arauz, who's really facing lawfare in terms of, it was incredibly difficult for him to get on the ballot in the first place. His political party and that of Rafael Correa has basically been banned. There was lawsuit after lawsuit preventing him from picking his own vice president, because there was a time, at one point it was going to be Correa himself, but the Ecuadorian courts forbade that. And now he's facing this kind of smear campaign, and they're attempting to link him to paramilitary groups in Colombia, which is absolutely absurd. And we saw kind of something similar happen, a similar dynamic occur in Bolivia, especially with, you had this case of this woman named Janice Daza, who became this kind of symbol of the supposed left in Bolivia, who was concerned about the environmental consequences of forest fires and the Morales government's apparent neglect of that. And now we're seeing a similar dynamic in terms of Yacu Perez in Ecuador, who's presenting himself as this very progressive candidate when he's anything but. I mean, this is a guy who's on record as supporting the coup in Bolivia, who's on record as saying, you can't give money to the poor because they're just going to spend it on beer. But I mean, Diana is right. There's kind of been tensions between the citizens' revolution in Ecuador and the indigenous communities of Ecuador. And so that's been something that the right wing has exploited very well. They failed to do that in Bolivia. But, all these left-wing movements in the various countries we're talking about are big tents, right? And they have kind of natural fissures. And really what we've seen, especially in the past, say, 8 or 9 years, has been the United States really kind of taking advantage of these fissures and kind of attempting to break the left throughout the region.
All right, thank you very much. Leonardo and Adriana. So we do have a few more minutes, I'm told. We don't have to end right at 8. So if anyone has any final questions or comments that you want to pose of our speakers, please do so. I had a question of my own about prospects for economic policy under Arce, and how Leonardo and Adriana predict economic policy may evolve under Arce. Are we going to see basically a continuation of Evo Morales's policies, or perhaps a deepening, perhaps a radicalization, or a modification in other ways of prior Mas policies? So Adriana, why don't you go first?
Bueno, no está muy claro para mí. El gobierno no ha planteado.
It's not so clear to me. The government hasn't said what its economic strategy will be to face the crisis, and also to face the corruption the de facto government engaged in, against the loans that acquired, the destruction of the documents that make it hard to prosecute them. So lots of things that the coup regime did. So I think that's the main problem right now. Regarding the continuity of policies, what is sure is that there's going to be a policy of bonuses for people. So money for people, money for pregnant women, money for children. So these are policies that will continue. But nevertheless, this isn't enough. The bonuses aren't enough. So we need to find economic stabilization because in terms of generating stability for investment and for business people, it also affects the microeconomy, the daily economies, which is where I think the government should focus its efforts on. But for now, there has been a plan for loans for business people and small stimuluses for medium-sized businesses. But for those of us who are part of the informal sector, which is a major sector of the country, people who work the lands, there has been no plan yet for economic activation. Yeah, and I would add that, one of the things the coup regime did was really they paralyzed state industries, right? I think there was something like did a count of how many state industries or companies were basically frozen and stopped receiving funds during the coup, and it was something like 40 of them. So that's huge. The fact that they're being reactivated, and just I think in the last month or so, the Arce government reactivated, say, a solar plant that had just been left, basically to stop producing energy, which is ridiculous because the sun is free and you already made this big investment in it, and the Añez regime stopped using it and stopped funding it. And so I think that's going to be the first place that we're going to see movement from the Arce government, is to kind of revitalize these state industries and reinvest in them and make sure they're up and running again, because it's really surprising how much damage a government can do in 1 year in power, and the Añez government certainly did a lot of damage. They sought to privatize basic services, including electricity, telecommunications, education, health, water, and so I think there's going to be a big kind of initial first push to reinvest in everything that the Añez government kind of ignored during their time in office. But beyond that, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I mean, I think that's still an open question, Kevin, about whether this process is going to deepen or not. And so when I was in Bolivia for the elections, that's something I kept asking people, because I saw a lot of parallels between the coup in Bolivia and the 48-hour coup in Venezuela in 2002. And after the coup in Venezuela, the Bolivarian revolution became much deeper. and it went, it became socialist 4 years after that, whereas previously it wasn't even socialist. What I heard was that, it was unclear, but that the social movements were certainly going to push for a deepening of the process, for a radicalization of the process. As you heard Adriana say, because so many people have been kind of excluded from the formal economy, that there has to be a big push to make sure that these people are to make sure that if you put in a hard day's work, that you can live. And I think a big part of that really is going to be political education. And I think that was something I heard over and over again when I was in Bolivia, was that one of the big deficiencies of the MAS, or at least of being in power for 14 years prior to the coup, was that you had this kind of bureaucracy that sprang up, and it hurt the social movements because you have a friendly government in power. And so if social movements are used to agitating on the streets to get what they want, suddenly you don't really want to take to the streets if the person in the presidency is an ally, because that makes everyone look bad. But then if you're not taking to the streets, how are you exercising power from below? And so that's a really interesting dynamic that's being worked at still in Bolivia, and really in every country in the left that has a leftist government in the region. And so I also saw kind of a question in the chat about Evo Morales, so I'll bring this in real quick. That's something that he's been doing a lot, is giving, as part of his campaigning for the MAS in the upcoming elections, is really kind of breaking down what capitalism means, what privatization means, how it directly affects the Bolivian people, particularly the poor, working class, and indigenous peoples. And so I think we're going to have to see more of that in terms of really getting everyone to understand what it is they're fighting against, because it's one thing to say, oh, we're going to be decolonial, we're going to be anti-capitalist, but then really understanding that is part of the problem of understanding what that implies is something that is a challenge that still needs to be met.
Great. Well, thank you both again. One last call. If anyone has additional questions you'd like to pose, please do so now. We are just about at the end point. All right. Well, not seeing any questions per se coming in through the chat. So it's about 8:15. I guess we can call it a night. Yoav says, what about Evo? Yoav, did you mean other than what Leonardo just said?
What is he doing nowadays?
Sí. Bueno, creo que todo lo que está pasando en la región, no
Well, I
solamente
think everything that's happening in the region, in Bolivia and Ecuador and Brazil, shows that the people's processes have to have power within the people and not just in one person. I think that's been a weakness in the case of Evo, Correa, and Lula. And it's been a kind of a learning process for people. So I think Evo's understanding that. It's been hard for him, but he's understanding it. And he's now doing his work within the MAS. He's the president of the party. He's been taking part in the campaigns for the elections for Sunday. And there's been lots of questioning. But I think he's been having a low profile lately. He's supporting certain sectors, especially where he's well received, but there are other places where he's not so well received. So I think this self-criticism is important, and we have to keep learning. But we have to learn from kind of a non-caudillo, I'm not sure how to translate that, sorry, or non kind of personal figure perspective and more of a people's perspective. Yeah, and I would just add that, Evo, I mean, I think there were a lot of people, especially among the leaders of social movements, who were maybe a little disappointed when the coup happened and when Evo fled. But among the masses of people, he remains wildly popular. I don't know if people saw when Evo returned to Bolivia in November 2020, but there were huge crowds in every town he stopped at. So he's still a very important figure. He has said that he's not going to take a position in the government. He is the president of the party, as Adriana said, and so I think that's what he's going to dedicate himself to for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I suppose that we should probably end now, but before we do so, I'd like to ask Adriana and Leonardo if they have any closing thoughts for those of us in the audience, especially perhaps those of us in the United States. Is there anything you would like to ask of us or that you would hope for from us listening tonight?
Well, as part of a social organization, discussions about health are very important, but for us, the priority is justice. We formed from the gas massacre, and we lived through the impunity of the Sanchez de Lozada government. So for us, if there's something important from international solidarity, is to remember, to not forget the coup, not forget that Janine Áñez and Fernando Camacho are committed massacres, and that we want justice. And that's what international bodies and international solidarity should focus on. Yeah, and I would add that, I really love the work that Massachusetts Peace Action does, and really keep at it, because you're one of the few organizations that has impact with your own Congress people, and I think it's very important because the Massachusetts delegation can be pressured into taking positions that help people in, say, Bolivia or Venezuela or Cuba. So really keep at it, keep bugging your Congress people about showing solidarity towards the people of Latin America, and to really, the idea is, don't interfere and keep the U.S. out of Bolivia, out of Ecuador, out of Venezuela, out of everywhere, basically.
Manny, I see a hand. Is that you wanting to speak?
Yeah, thank you everyone. This was an amazing webinar, and gracias Adriana, gracias Leonardo, and of course Kevin, amazing presentation. Pero la pregunta mía es, estamos escuchando mucho acerca de la vacuna en Cuba. ¿Qué ustedes piensan de que Cuba quiere compartir con países? ¿Ustedes creen que Bolivia sería uno de los países con que Cuba puede compartir la vacuna?
Yo creo que sí. Es más, la primera decisión que hemos exigido al gobierno de Luis Arce es que retornen las brigadas de médicos cubanos a Bolivia.
Yes, one of the first things we asked of the Arce government is the return of the Cuban brigades.
Pero no ha sido posible porque como está en el gobierno está planteando una conciliación con los distintos sectores, es decir, una conciliación con la derecha. La derecha no quiere que retornen los cubanos, la derecha no quiere la vacuna cubana, y finalmente terminamos haciendo lo que quiere la derecha. Eso no es conciliación, eso es imposición. Y en este momento estamos en esa situación.
So that's the situation we're facing. Let me just translate the question into English. It was about the Cuban vaccine. What do you think of Cuba sharing that vaccine, and can Bolivia receive it? I think internally in Bolivia it might be difficult to receive it for the reasons that again I just said. But I'd also say that the Chinese vaccine and the Russian vaccine have been under attack in the right-wing media all throughout Latin America, and yet that's the vaccine that is currently being administered in Bolivia. They have both Sputnik and the Sinopharm Chinese vaccine. So it's not out of the question that there can be some sort of agreement between Bolivia and Cuba for the vaccine, the Cuban vaccine to be sent to Bolivia. I would imagine that it will happen at some point, even if it's just a symbolic number of doses, because I think it's going to be important to kind of rebuild those ties of solidarity between the Cuban and Bolivian governments that have existed for so long until the Áñez regime kind of attempted to destroy them.
Okay, well, I think that about does it for our session tonight. Thank you so much to our speakers, Leonardo Flores and Adriana Guzman Arroyo, and to all of our audience members, those who asked questions. And I'm sure that we will all continue to follow the situation in Bolivia. And this will not be the last webinar on Bolivia that Massachusetts Peace Action and the Latin American Solidarity Coalition will be having. So thank you again, Adriana. Muy buenas noches.
Buenas noches, gracias.
A usted.
Good night, thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you.
Good
Thank
seeing
you.
everyone.